Good day to you from Ecologic on this Saturday, July 18th. We are continuing a series in the synthesis of religion and science. If you haven't tuned into those prior videos, there weren't many and they weren't that long, and I always summarize as we proceed so that you don't have to worry about going back and listening to those if you don't want to, because you don't need to. Although there's more detail that you might want. You'll see on the screen the word authority, and that's where we are in a sequence of uniting science and religion, where we've come upon the primary question facing certainly science, but possibly also religion could be the same question, which is what? Origins. Very simple. The hardest question ever asked of a human mind. But it's very simple. Where do you come from? So who's you? Well, of course, you yourself, but then you're part of the human race, and that's really what we're after in science, is where do humans come from? Well, you have to go back into the past. Well, you can't. You can't go back into the past. And that's a huge hurdle because now you have to rely on authority. What did your ancestors say about origins? And can you believe them? Because you have to decide this question, or you can't know anything about either science or religion. And that's everything. So this is the question that has to be answered by science, because science is a guide. Of course, so is religion. Not in science it's not. You only have science, and you don't have religion. You have science. And we discussed very, very carefully what that is. Now, in the case of origins, you have the scientific testimony presently, from my perspective, of Western science over the past 200 years has decided on a framework for analyzing where we come from. But here you do have to be cautious about what you mean by we, because of course primarily we mean humans. But we are not alone. We're one of about 1.5 million cellular organism species. And the human genome is very similar to the other 1.5 million locked DNA codes. Now, to say it's locked is contested. So you are immediately presented with a scientific question. Is the species code for the 1.5 million species locked or not? Because if it's locked, then the creation framework is much more appropriate for the ecology and or the human race. Is the human race separate from the ecology? That's a yes-no question that has to be answered. It's not answered unless you trust somebody. It could be your scientific authorities. Is the genome locked for humans? And does that make humans different from the species, whereby perhaps you shouldn't even say that the human genome is a species? It's not a genomic, that is, transformable species. Now, the current dominant model includes speciation, which is for the plants and animals, but it's not for humans. But there's a major branch of the speciation model that includes humans in the speciation process, which is a process. And you can't know your origins, either for the human race or for the 1.5 million species, unless you decide the question first. Can you transform the species? Does it change? Well, the current model says that it must, and that's a logical theory. So that has to be taken seriously. But is it provable? That is extremely hotly contested, whereby one model has come out dominant, but by no means can it be said that it's proved. Which is simply, the answer is yes. Humans are absolutely conformable to the speciation process, because that's the only explanation for how the human race got here. It's speciated, which means that it was derived from prior species. So that's the model. That model sounds absurd to some people, But to other people, they can't believe that anybody would question that. And that has to be decided. Absolutely has to be decided. Well, there's going to be bloodshed then. You're going to die for whatever you say. Well, you better be willing to die because the other side will kill you in both cases. So you can't be wrong. You have to be right. You have to get this right. So science has endeavored to get it right. And now it's done. They are right. They say. Who's they? Well, it's a very small percentage of men, actually. If you count the white race, which came up with this theory, and only the white race has this theory. Now, it may have spread, just as black people spread to North America. But that has nothing to do with origins. They were dragged to North America. They didn't go to North America. They were taken to North America. So it's the same thing when you're talking about, well, what are we talking about is where do humans come from? Well, you're going to have to believe somebody because it's in the past. Are you going to believe your scientists? Which scientists? There's 8 billion people alive, and there have been approximately 16 billion people who've ever lived. So who are you talking about when you say the scientists? Well, a loud-mouthed bunch of white men. This was developed strictly by white men. Well, it's just a remarkable fact. Now you could say, well, no, everybody believes it now because it's so obvious. That is being said. Well, can you prove that? You don't take anybody's word for anything. Oh, really? Hundreds of thousands or whatever you say of PhDs, they've been saying this for 2 centuries, like, well, if enough time goes by, it must be true. Well, you can't make a mistake on this. You have to be able to prove it to yourself. You can't believe PhDs. They're human. How the hell would they know? There's no degree for knowing this. There is a degree, however, for logic. And they do have a good case. And who's they again? Well, not very many, really. The ones who are vociferous. Not people like you and me who just believe what they say. We don't count. It's what they say. It's what they say that counts, because that determines what you must believe. Now, who is authorizing all this? Well, that's the question. Authority. Where do these PhDs get off saying that they know exactly where humans come from? Because they do say that. And they all say that. Well, who are they? Who are they? Who are they? Not many men. Not even 1 billion. Not even 1 million. If you start talking about maybe hundreds of thousands of men, all of whom are white, this theory has only been around for 200 years. And what theory are we talking about? It's the origin of the ecology with or without humans. It's the origin of the life system on this planet. Well, if you don't know that, you don't know anything. You have to get this right. Or that's it for you if you don't. So what's your answer? Well, you may not want to answer, or you may not know, or you may, like perhaps millions of people just, this is their religion. You could say they don't need any proof. It's so obvious that humans are descended from the ecology. Well, there's a very good reason that a lot of people agree on that. Why is that said? Well, first of all, because we as humans, the human race, is a cellular organism. And every single form of life on Earth, except for the virus, is a cellular organism. And that's 1.5 million to just a handful of viruses. Although viruses are very strange. They're much smaller than a cell. But everything else is made of cells, which are gigantic compared with a virus. Just one cell. And there are single-celled organisms, lots of them. It's a major kingdom, but mostly it's animals and plants. That's fair to say, although it's not complete. The fungi are considered to be a separate kingdom. I've looked this up. I made a tremendous study on my own, of course, not to get a degree, but just to know what is said about the kingdoms of life on Earth. there's a maximum of 6. Some people say you can narrow it to 5. It has been narrowed to 4, and that's fairly good. But at one time there were only 3, and before that for a long time there were only 2. Plants and animals. There's definitely plants. There's about 500,000 of those. And there are about 1 million animals. And there's exactly 1 man. Is the race. Is it a species? Oh. We're a cellular organism. We have the same DNA structure. It's DNA. We found that out in the 20th century, so that's pretty confirmatory. We're cellular organisms. Humans are cellular organisms. So yes, Darwinism has a very firm foundation right there, then and there, because it's obvious, just like the sun flies through the sky. Well, you see the problem. Are you sure? Perhaps your frame of reference is wrong. Perhaps you're way off base. Perhaps humans have nothing to do with species. There's strong evidence for that, actually confirmatory evidence. But that's hotly debated, because that doesn't match the model that's now true. Well, who says it's true? Well, it depends on whom you believe. Authority. What's your authority? Well, now, it is commonly said, this is a heated issue, as you know. It is commonly said that there is another authority. What other authority? Other than what the universe says? I would say, if I were Darwin and I didn't know anything about religion or the Bible, which Darwin definitely did know, and it really scared him. He didn't really want to publish, because he knew the goddamn church would go after him, because they have the authority to say where humans come from. So what was the church in authority? We reject that out of hand. We're scientists. So no, the church had no authority. Well, then why did they pretend to have authority? Well, they pretended to have authority. Well, are the scientists pretending to have authority? You could say that of anybody. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. The only way you can decide is if you can prove it to yourself one way or the other. Is that authority reliable? Which could be on a spectrum, you might not be sure. Can you be honest in that case? Historically, it's very hard to say that it's easy to be unbiased about that. Because either you believe one authority or you believe the other, and you may think, and you may have been taught, or you may simply know that you can't have two authorities. If they differ, only one can be right. And in the question of origins, you can't be wrong. You can't make any mistake about that. You have to be absolutely right. No in between. Where are humans from? Well, it's a yes-no question. Are we descended from the ecology or not? How would you go about answering that? You might come from your training. Well, which one? There are two. What if you know them both and you can't decide? I believe a lot of men fall into that category. Well, you'd better fall into that category if you're a scientist. You have to be fair. Nobody else is going to be fair except the scientist. So that makes you the authority. Well, how so? Because you could say anything. Well, do you have proof? Well, who's going to say whether you have proof or not? Who's going to be the final authority on your submittal of your proof? Because anybody can just say, there's your proof, we reviewed it, you're full of shit. So get out. Fuck you and your proof. And if they're the authority, well, who's the authority? I think that's very difficult to answer in both cases. But is it the authority of the Bible? That's what we're going to cover today. Is the Bible an authority? Well, whose Bible? Which Bible? At what time? For what reason? To prove what? A book? No. We don't want a book. We have to regard that book. You know why? It contains the records that go back to the beginning of time. Can you trust that? No, you can't trust that. But if you were raised to trust it because you know that Jesus wrote the Bible or something that you were taught. You don't want to be making fun of stuff like that, but if you're a scientist Yes, you do. It's not to make fun. It's to be absolutely correct. You have to know the answer, not guess, not choose sides. You're not choosing sides. You're the final authority. You are. Well, I'm going to help you become that final authority for the question that you must ask. If you're a scientist, as I've said very carefully, you have got to pass a bar. You say you're a scientist, okay. Where are humans from? Because if you can't answer that, you're not a scientist. You may end up saying you don't know. That's actually a very, very good habit to get into. If you're unsure, say so. If you're not sure, you say so. Because you're the authority. You're higher than the Pope. Well, because the Pope doesn't use logic. And neither does anybody else except you. Only you can validate the logic that you've already validated is the right form of logic, and if it conforms to your logic, it passes the test. But you have to do it. You have to do it. You can't get out of this one. This has nothing to do with quantum mechanics, electrodynamics, or any form of mechanics or dynamics. This has nothing to do with anything except, are you a scientist or not? Because a scientist is the final authority on everything. You know why? Because this is in the prior videos, but I'm just going to sum it up. It's because you claim to use the logic that the universe taught you to solve the problems the universe gave you. And you're not going to any book. You're not going to consult with any man. You have to actually know. But you have to do more than that. You have to make it so that everybody else can know it too, with a proof sequence. Are humans descended from the ecology or not? It certainly looks like we are. I think I'm just going to step right out and be that guinea pig, because I claim to be the authority, and I don't make any bones about it. I know the answer. I'm the authority. But only for myself. You have to begin with yourself. Because if you can't convince yourself, there's no point in trying to convince anybody else. Because they can't afford to believe you or me or anybody else. You can't afford to believe the Pope. You can't afford to believe Charles Darwin. You have to be able to prove what Charles Darwin was trying to prove. Can you do that? You have to do it. You have to. All right. So that's the nature of authority. It's quite stentorian. There's no room for crybabies. There's no room for pansies. You have to be absolutely courageous, and you have to be willing to take the fall. You're going into the octagon. You're going into the ring. And you have to choke out your opponent. This is a fight to the death, because you have to get it. Nothing else matters if you don't get this. What again? Where does the ecology come from? The second question will concern humans because that's the main question. But the first thing you have to answer, where does the ecology come from? Because it's 1.5 million to 1. There's 1.5 million species, and then there's the race of man. The race of man is distinct. Nobody questions that. How distinct is it? It doesn't speciate. We don't come from a tree. Well, actually, that depends on your authority. There is a very strong authority which believes it has solid proof we do come from a tree, which is kind of a pun, but let's not, you don't want to get emotional. It's not that we're descended from monkeys. It's not that we're descended from the trees. Perhaps that's the right extrapolation, but only if you have the answer first, which is it true? Is it true that humans derived from the ecology in the same way that the other 1.5 million species Speciated. They speciated. Well, did humans speciate in the same way? The answer is yes or no, and there's no in between. Compromise has been tried by very diplomatic parties. I am privy to the inner circle conversations on both sides of this heated debate, which must be answered. And it's is nothing more serious than this. This is why, well, it gets emotional, because it's ultimately divisive. Because both sides have absolutely solid proof for what they say. That's not true. That can't be true. One side has it wrong, and there's no in between. Because the question is, did humans speciate or not? And the specific question then is the origin of man traceable such that it does not go back more than 10,000 years? That is the oldest theory of all, is that human beings did not exist in any shape, way, or form before about 10,000 years ago. All right. The authority that was used to establish that so powerfully for the first several thousand years of the human race, really up until the last 2 centuries, when there's a contender. There's a contender from the white scientists of Europe. This came out of England. You may say, well, it doesn't matter where it came from. I would agree, but that is where it came from. It came from the technologists. And so there's just an association there, because this is forensic. This goes to who's the biggest liar, because somebody is lying big. There's nothing small about this, and there's no room for pansies. You're either lying or you're not. And it's not a question of who's telling the truth. It's a question of who is lying. You have to find the liar. And whoever is lying the worst, you have to figure out where they lied and show it. That's science. That's what we do. That's what a guide does. We get to the bottom of it. It's Sherlock Holmes or some superhero. You're calling in the final authority. That's myself. I'm the final authority because I say so. Can you believe you? Of course you can't believe that. So let's do it. Here's my proof. I know the answer and I'm going to prove it to you. Does that sound like bias? Not in this case. Not in this case it's not bias. In this case I know, and I can prove who's lying. And both sides are, but I won't. And so I'm going to show you where the original theory came from. The authority. The authority. So let's begin. I will take a brief pause, but you'll only feel a nanosecond delay. I'll be right back. All right. I used to say you should just glug the water, just show them what you just blub-de-blub-de-blub, but that time I thought, I'm not sure how long I'm going to be drinking. I was as dry as a camel. Well, it's 100 degrees here today. You may see me sweating. I hope you don't. It just makes my face shine, okay? But I did need some very cold water. So, the first thing I need to inform you of is that we don't need the Bible, necessarily. You're certainly going out on a limb already to credit a human record. Well, it comes on high authority, which is what we're going to discuss. But we don't need it. Why not? Because the ultimate truth is not from a book. Science is premised on the universe will tell you where you're from. Just you have to be smart. You have to be smarter than the average bear. Which you youths may not recognize where that's from. That's Yogi the Bear. And if you did know, goody for you. What is the ultimate authority? It's what we call the universe, the environment. You just take readings, you make measurements, you look around, you put it together, you figure out a model, and you make it stick because it's obviously true. You can prove it. Well, what does the universe say? Well, it took a long time to actually prove which one of those two answers is true, which is, are humans descended from the ecology or not? Really, the question is, did the species speciate? Because if they did, then you're really talking about, did humans speciate in the same way? So there are two questions. But you have to get them both. And you can't get one unless you get the other. So you have to get them both. Did the species speciate, and in consequence of that, did humans speciate also? Well, if you begin by saying that the animals and plants speciated, I think you're well on the way to showing that humans probably speciated too, wouldn't you say? I would. So Darwin had a good case for both his books. His first book was only on plants and animals. Now, you may already know that, but a lot of people don't. That his first book, which made the big splash, was Where Are the Animals and Plants From? Where's the Ecology from? Where did that originate? Really, the question is when. When did it originate? Well, I think you could make a case for deep time. Well, how else you would need millions of years, certainly, for that kind of slow process. But can that be proved? Well, that's exactly what we need to know. Is that true? Did the species speciate? I'll be giving you the answer, and it's going to surprise everybody, because nobody got it right. Nobody got it right. Darwin definitely did not, and he knew that he didn't. And I've given several videos on that. I think it's really quite interesting. It is an absolute fact. Everybody knows it. Darwin did not believe his own theory, and he said so. So I consider Darwin to be a very honest scientist. After that, we need to find out the liars. I don't believe Darwin was a liar. He was a Darwinist. There's no way he could be a neo-Darwinist. And it's the neo-Darwinists that are liars. You know why? It has to do with the definition of neo-Darwinism. What's the neo? It's the discovery of DNA. Darwin had no idea about DNA. DNA wouldn't be discovered for another century. That's a fact. So what do the neo-Darwinists say? They say that DNA proves our case. Are they telling the truth? Can you prove what they think they've proved? Can you go through the same sequence that they went through? I'll be showing you that. But you see, that has nothing to do with the Bible. The Bible simply gives a framework for a time reference. But you don't need it to answer the question. You may want to know the corroborative evidence that comes from the human record, but that's not, strictly speaking, hard science. Well, it's not hard science, but you can still use forensics to decide the case of the authority of the Bible, which is only the first 2 chapters of Genesis. It's not all 66 books of what's called by the Christians the Holy Bible. It's not 66 books. It's not even most of Genesis. It's just the first 2 chapters. It's actually just the first chapter, which says, which you can check, which we're going to check, the origin of both the ecology and humans was no more than 10,000 years ago. And that can be proved if you accept the forensic evidence of the genealogical record that's embedded in the text, which has been studied by Christian scholars and Islam scholars for centuries, which means that that kind of scholarship goes back a long ways, a lot closer to the time frame that we need to examine. Which, where did this record come from? Who says that Genesis isn't just made up? Well, of course, in some sense, it is made up, because a man wrote it. Oh, there's no way around that. Oh, you can say it came from God all you want. A scientist isn't going to give in to that. No, it didn't come from God. Well, unless you can prove it. Well, I don't think you need to begin that way. You just, what do the facts say? Well, ever since the discovery of DNA, we know the answer to both questions. Except, not quite. It's obvious that the species speciated. There's 1.5 million species, okay? Whether you believe in the Darwinianism is that it was produced by natural selection. which has nothing to do with DNA. It has to do with pressure from the environment that forced out the changes. That's natural selection. But then the DNA was discovered. That's the end of natural selection, quite brutally, frankly, because it's not due to the pressure of the environment. It's due to a code. Well, you would have to ask the question, how long did it take for millions of final products to speciate? And they're not speciating anymore. There's zero evidence that there's any speciation going on. But there's a lot of, you would have to say, fairly obvious evidence, as Darwin pointed out. Sure looks like they speciated. It sure looks like they speciated, because how else are you going to explain the diversification of the finch genus? I know I'm using some technical terms, but, I have to be the authority. I have to know what I'm talking about. I do. Did the finches speciate? They certainly did. How long did it take? An extremely short period of time. A miraculously short period of time. Was there enough time? Yes. There was plenty of time to speciate 1.5 million species. Okay, then you would say when? When did that happen? When did it begin? When did it end? There have been no new species in the history of mankind. The animals and plants are not speciating now. What do you mean now? Well, really, right now, they're not. Well, really, not, you could say, since we've known that there are species on Earth. Have we seen any of them speciate? Well, you may counter. They could still be speciating. There just hasn't been enough time to tell. Okay, well, that makes sense. So you have a prima facie case for speciation. So it's only a question of the time frame. How long did it take for the species to speciate? Well, millions of them? I would have to say deep time is a good guess. Darwin took the guess because deep time had just been discovered in geology. That is, theorized. That the rock of Earth is millions of years old. Well, if the rock of Earth is millions of years old, and that has been proved, yes, well, now you have deep time. That the rock was not created less than 10,000 years ago. The rock has been here for about the same time span as the solar system itself. So do we have information about the solar system itself? Yes, because we've studied stars. And we know how long stars live. And that has been proved. And the sun is a well-known type of star, and we're talking about billions of stars, and they're all part of an organization of stars. And how long does a typical star last? Billions of years. So how old is the solar system? About 4 billion years. So the rock is 4 billion years old. Well, that means you have deep time. Well, so how long has the ecology been here? You could easily say hundreds of millions of years. Is that what is said? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you have that much time, so use it. But is it true? Well, it's a good model. And that's the dominant model. And that's all there is to it. There's no proof at all that it is true. No proof at all that it's true. But there is now proof that it's not true. And that's been discovered by science. You don't have to take my word for it. You can read the Wikipedia articles that say that. And there's some authority for saying that species cannot speciate ever at all, not at all. They don't speciate. Even though it's obvious they did, they didn't. So what happened instead? Only I know the answer. And it doesn't contradict anything in physics. And it also doesn't contradict anything in the Bible. Well, that's the first time any man has come up with a theory of that nature. Well, I did. So that's where we begin with the authority. All of which was simply to say that we don't have to rely on the Bible for the proof. The proof has already been made. There is scientific proof, not just evidence, but proof, that the human race is no longer, the endurance of the human race as a species. Really, you'd have to say just as a race. The question is, are we a species? Because that would mean that we speciated. We did not. That's been proved. Absolutely proved. And if you don't know that, you don't know your science. Well, you see, now that you've got about 100,000 experts that would kill me for saying that, because I'm saying, don't believe those liars. I started out by warning you. This is to the death. Whoever wins this takes it all. I'm the authority, but I'm not. Science is the authority, and I am the truthful interpreter of science. And that's a form of authority. You have the facts. It's just that you have either liars or imbeciles. They're either lying or they're simply retarded. When did the ecology appear? Well, I haven't talked about that yet. I've only talked about human history. How long has the human race been here? Less than 10,000 years. So if the human species speciated, it had to have been within the last 10,000 years. And no model says that. Because they can't. Because the nature of the speciation process is so drawn out over millions, actually hundreds of millions of years. The vertebrate, the mammals, the primates, and then the hominids, and then man. The time frame for that is millions of years. And nobody's ever tried to shorten that, because there's not enough time. How do you know that? Well, because we have records of how many people have existed on the Earth in a geometric regression, so that we know when the first two humans appeared, by mathematics. You're not sure how long it took at first, such that there may have been a very small population of humans for millions of years. And so even though humans only have records of their existence that goes back less than 10,000 years, there's a big gap where humans were not writing. That's the model. That's the dominant model. How true is it? It's very helpful to have a second witness, which is that record. Well, there's a lot of human records. There's records from China. There's records from North and South America, from Africa, from Europe, from Asia. There are records that go back, well, how far do they go back? Well, the oldest records of mankind are traceable back to somewhere in the northern mid-latitudes, somewhere around essentially the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, is where men started to write. And that's been proved. Because we can trace to a certain threshold how humans migrated over the earth. We have direct evidence of that. So we have a very good I'm not sure how to pronounce it, I'll just say physiological. We have a definite distribution of human types, but they're not species, but they're different human types. Mostly we classify that on color, in which case you get 4 distinct colors. Distinct. And not much in between. And that's the blacks and whites. That's 15% white, essentially Europe and Russia. Originally, you'd have to go back a ways. Well, how far? Well, just a couple of thousand years. And it's pretty much been that way ever since. That the whites exist in Europe and Russia. And the blacks is 15% exist in southern Africa and Australia and New Zealand and a few islands. And the blacks all live way down south. And the whites all live way far north. And together that's 30%. Well, then all the browns are in between, but on the other side of the Himalaya mountains, they're Oriental. And those are the 4 major groups on Earth. The Orientals I believe, outnumber everybody else, certainly right now. About 1 billion people in China, I think. But in any case, about 1 billion of them. And there are a lot of people in India, which is kind of it's almost separate. You could almost say there's like 5 groups. But essentially white, black, and brown. And you could even leave it at 3, except for those Himalaya mountains. You can't, because the Orientals are distinct from the Levantine. So you have 4 major groups, and that's reasonable, because all we're looking for is a ballpark figure. Because now we can trace back, where did the whites come from? Where did the blacks come from? In terms of time frame. They weren't speciating, but they were definitely... There's a word for what humans do as they form into these types. And it's not a speciation, but it is a diversification, where the whites remain white, tend to have blue eyes. The Africans and Australians, the so-called blacks, have very dark colored eyes, irises, and a certain kind of hair, and certainly their skin color is quite dark. And then you have the browns, who are essentially, well, you could say just the descendants of Abraham, who live basically in the Iranian plateau all the way to the eastern Mediterranean. Are brown people of that type. They're not Oriental. But if you cross the Himalayas, they have different eye shape, and a different kind of hair, and a different, really it's called a different phenotype, which is a natural variation within the locked code of humans. So, we do have a time frame for how long humans have been on the earth. It's obvious they began brown, which means they began in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, very close to the Ararat Plateau, and it's called that, the Ararat Plateau. So where did we get this idea that humans originated about 10,000 years ago or less? It's because there are no records of humans older than about 8,000 years. None. Zero. No record of human existence prior to 10,000 years ago. None. No evidence. Zero. Is that true? That has been contested because of the fossil evidence, where human bones have been found at the, you would say, the highest layer of fossil remains. And so there's a whole model that deals with the transition into when there were human records, but there were humans for about 3 million years. And that's the dominant model today. It's not finalized, because who could be certain, but what they say is, because there are 3 million years available to use, because of the geological record, seems to indicate that you could make a good case that there were human hominids, that they were human for 3 million years. So you're placing the origin of the human race 3 million years ago exactly. It's to a day. Because that's how a new genome emerges. It has to be in a certain generation. You have to finally have the quantum jump, because once DNA was discovered, it has to be in the code. It's the code that determines the species, not pressure. It's not due to natural selection. What is said in neo-Darwinism is that the ecologic pressure caused the mutations. But there had to be one final mutation to make the locked code that describes the code of the blacks, the whites, the Levantine browns, and the Oriental browns, all the way out to the Polynesian browns and the North and South American browns. It's 70% brown is in the middle, and the whites are north and the blacks are south. That is a clock. That is not only a clock, it's a map. And that goes back 10,000 years, period. So the 3 million year theory for the origin of man is falsified absolutely. Absolutely falsified. Do you know why? It's because of the flood. It's because of the flood. When was that flood? It's been proved, it's in Wikipedia. There was a flood that destroyed all life. Now Wikipedia says 75%. Same thing. It had to start over. Virtually. 75%? Well, when was that? The geologists have helped to date that. The paleontologists and the geologists have a date for that flood, which was proved in the 1980s. It was the first time we had direct evidence of the worldwide flood. Was in the 1980s. No evidence had ever been adduced before that. It was either the Bible or nothing. You believed in the flood and when it was, which was 7,000 years ago. According to the Bible it was. Can you rely on that record? You can now, but it's still a secondary record. But it's absolutely corroborative of what science has discovered. Yes, there was a flood. Can we date it? Yes. It's been demonstrated how long ago that flood occurred. How long ago was it then? 7,000 years ago is when that flood occurred. Is that what the Bible says? It sure does. How can we validate the secondary witness? Because that sure would help if human records actually already say that. You would have to go back to the time of the flood. You can. Well, you would actually have to go back before the flood. Did anybody live before the flood who passed on a record so that it still existed after the flood? Is that possible? Only the Bible says that. Can you prove it? No. You can't. What you can prove is that there was a flood, and after the flood, there was speciation. And I can prove that from the most ancient prophecy on earth, which says that the angels came back and helped Noah, and when they were done helping Noah build that thing, which they had better have helped him, because Noah could never have done that alone. And he didn't do it alone. And it says in the book of Enoch, the angels assisted him. Well, they certainly did. And then he wrote out the flood. That's what Enoch says. Noah, my grandson, I believe it says great-grandson, Noah, they knew each other. And Enoch wrote it all down. There's going to be a flood. And Noah said, the Lord told me the same thing. There's going to be a flood. So they wrote it down. And that's in the Bible. That was written down. And then Noah carried that book. This has been proved. Although it may not have been a book, we can't actually prove that it was a book. What we can prove is that Enoch wrote a book. What we can't prove, because there's no actual statement anywhere, not even the book of Enoch, not that I could find, that Noah took a book with him that Enoch wrote. But after Noah got off the boat, there appeared among men a book written by Enoch, which obviously Noah wrote. And that is in the Bible, that Noah wrote that, and that's why Noah is considered to be one of the most important prophets in Islam and in Christianity, and obviously in Judaism, which we're going to discuss all three now in terms of authority. Where does that record come from? It comes from Enoch, which had to come from Noah. So Noah reproduced it. How do we know that? It came into the hands of Moses. Moses received that record. And that's where the story gets incredibly complicated. Because you know that the first book in the Bible could not have been written by Adam. It could not have been written by anybody in the book of Genesis. It had to be written by somebody who lived after the birth of the 12 tribes of Israel, because that's where the book of Genesis ends, is with the birth of the 12 children that were called the tribes of Israel. And once those 12 tribes are established and their father gave his blessing to each of the tribes and then kicked the bucket, the book of Genesis ends. And that's the oldest record in mankind. The Chinese have nothing like it. Nobody anywhere has anything like that record. How do we know anything about it? Because eventually the Israelites wrote it down at the time of Moses. And Moses is in the first chapter of the second book. The book called Exodus begins with Moses. And that was over 400 years later that Moses got hold of the book of Enoch. And he turned it into Israeli scripture. So he didn't write the book of Genesis. He transcribed it. And that can be indirectly proved, because there's no way Moses could have known the things in Genesis. Moses could not have written the book of Genesis. Now, the modern Western Christians say that yes, Moses must have written Genesis because the Bible says so. Islam cannot and will not accept that testimony. No, he did not write it, because he couldn't have. So somebody is lying about the Genesis record, and I know who it is, because I know where the Genesis record comes from, because that book of Enoch turned up in Ethiopia. It turned up in modern Ethiopia in 1800, and it was known of that the Ethiopians had the book of Enoch. It also turned up in Russia, called the Slavonic version. It also turned up in Babylon. There was a fake copy made by the Jews in Babylon. And that's extremely important, that the Jews who were in Babylon according to the curse of God, they're the ones who came back and built the temple, by the way. They were in Babylon. They were prisoners. And they absorbed the Babylonian culture. And so they took it upon themselves, a certain cadre, the Levites, decided to write their own version of Enoch. They forged it. They made what is called Enoch 4. There are 4 extant books that claim to be the book of Enoch. One of them is actually a spin-off of the Babylonian Enoch. It's usually called the Jewish Enoch, because it was written by Jews in Babylon as if it had been received by prophecy. In other words, they say that Enoch said what they say in their version of Enoch's book. So they forged Enoch's book. But what they didn't know, or couldn't know, or for whatever reason, they didn't care, there already was a valid book of Enoch. Well, of course there was. Or they wouldn't have forged it. So where was that hidden? Where was that kept? We're not sure. But it turned up in Ethiopia and it turned up in Russia. And I've checked both of those. It's the Ethiopic version. About 100 chapters long. It has embedded within it the prophecy given to Noah, which is much more extensive than that given in Genesis, which is basically just a summary. But Genesis has a lot of lines in it that are summarizations of the book of Enoch. So there is a confluence of evidence that there was a record that was written by a man who was given a message from heaven that there was going to be a flood, and a man survived the flood who verified that, and that came into the hands of Moses. But then the Levites got custody of it for the next few centuries, didn't they? There's a very interesting story of how the Levites lost the Torah. They lost the 5 books of Moses. That's in the Bible. And that has been analyzed by scholars. How could you possibly have lost the Torah? Well, then they miraculously found it. And you could check all this. This is all well known now. So how much of the Torah was rewritten by the Levites after they rediscovered it? We are not sure, although a lot of men believe they have great insight into who's forging what in the 5 books of Moses. Because the current theory, fully held by all of Christianity, is that those 5 books, Genesis and the next 4, were written by Moses. Nobody disagrees with that. Well, that's ridiculous. So we have a cover-up. And it has to do with the 5 books of Moses. Because of Genesis. Moses actually wrote down his own death, so they weren't very careful. That is, the Levites, who transcribed the Torah, which they lost and then recovered, and oh goody, we have it back, yeah, with some changes. How much they left out, nobody knows. But we do know that they constantly suppressed the book of Enoch, because Jesus had the book of Enoch, and that's been proved. Not only Jesus, but Jude, who's one of the accredited writers who followed up on Yeshua after Yeshua resurrected and ascended. Jude quotes directly from the book of Enoch. Jesus quoted from it all the time. It was obviously well known to him, because the stuff that he says is directly from Enoch, including the prophecy of the elect one, which is who Yeshua claimed to be. He was the elect one, prophesied by Enoch. He was that man. He was that one, the elect one, prophesied by Enoch, who also prophesied the flood. And both prophecies are in the same book. And I checked that book. It's authorized, because I say so. So I have information nobody else has. It's not nobody. I'm not actually alone in this. But you have to get everything right. You can't miss a trick. You can't be wrong about anything. You have to actually prove what you say I can. So, how long ago was the Ecology formed? It was formed 7,000 years ago. Uh-oh, we have direct evidence that it's older than that. Yes, we do. There was an Ecology before that. Oh, how long did that exist? Less than 12,000 years, certainly. So there was a prior Ecology of a few thousand years, and then there was a flood. But we actually know from the record of Adam, which was copied down by Enoch, which is also in Genesis. Who lived before the flood? How many men lived before the flood? There was Adam, and then the 7th from Adam was Enoch. And then the 3rd from Enoch was Noah. And that's where the first Ecology was ecocidally destroyed by a comet strike. And that's in Wikipedia. That's been dated to 65 million years ago. That's because of uniformitarian geology, which had no idea about sedimentary rock. Charles Lyell and all the 19th century geologists had no information about how the sedimentary rock got on Earth. That is, it covers the continents, but it doesn't cover the seafloors. The sedimentary rock of Earth only exists on the continents. There's none at the bottoms of the oceans. There's none at the bottom of the sea. That's basalt. But the continents have basalt underneath miles-thick layers of sedimentary rock. And that was discovered, it began to be discovered in the 19th century, and then it was, actually Chinese geologists discovered fossils in some mountain ranges, and there was a rather famous Chinese scientist quite a while ago, many centuries ago, way before Charles Lyell, who said he couldn't really figure out why there were undersea creatures fossilized in the mountains of China. So he did mention that. And there are other vague reports that are, you'd have to confirm, but really, nobody knew. Nobody was sure. But then sedimentary rock covers all the continents. It covers it in layers. They're horizontal layers of sedimentary rock. Well, where do they come from? Are those rocks millions of years old? You would have to say yes or no. Well, what's the right answer? They're not. The rock itself that makes the sedimentary, really the crystals that are compressed, that's what it is. It's pulverized rock that's been smashed. And that makes sedimentary layers. Well, that's not from volcanoes. That's from deep oceans. That's from water. Water makes sedimentary rocks. And only water does. Only water does. There's no other way. That's contested. So there's a big, huge lie. An enormous lie that hundreds of thousands of accreditable Western white scientists swear to God is true, except in the same breath, they say, well, there goes your fucking Bible. Because you can't have it both ways. So which one is right? The Bible is. Because it's scientifically right. And whoever says that mankind formed within 3 million years are wrong. And those who say that this ecology is millions of years old are wrong. It's only 7,000 years old at the most. That's been proved. And it just so happens that the Bible corroborates that absolutely. And so in the next video, we're going to go through this, and I'll show you what you're up for. That we're going to read one line at a time through this. There's the first line. There's the second line. There's the third line. Fourth. And then we'll just go through this. I may adjust this to more than one line. But of course you don't want to cover up my pretty face, do you? You might. So we'll have something like that so you can follow along. And then I'll make sure it's centered. And we're going to go through this whole thing, which is well more than one page. We're going to get into Yeshua and Islam. We're going to get into who knows what about what. Going back to the beginning of human history. All right? So that's what we're going to do. 2 pages of it, just an outline. I'll explain the whole thing so you'll know the authority of how humans got here. And what you do with that knowledge is, of course, up to you. I am not trying to influence you, except to give you the choices that you need to decide this for yourself. But if you don't know what science says, obviously you're not going to get the right answer unless it's by accident. It cannot be that. It has to be absolutely provable to a child. At least high school, but I say less. You have to be able to prove it. To any human. Where do humans come from? And you make it stick against anybody who contradicts you in any way. Whatever is the outcome, whether the Western white scientists win with their false theory and model, or whether the believers in, we'll just say, the accreditable transmission, are they right? Whoever gets it right takes the gold. And the others get kicked out. You will never be heard again. This is not debatable. But in order to prove it to an innocent seeker, you had better have your proof ready. Only I do. So that's what's going to be in the next video. The verification of the divine transmission of the prophecy of the elect one, who is the Messiah, who is about to return. Who says that? Muhammad does. There are two witnesses. There are two witnesses to Yeshua being the true Messiah about to arrive. And they're both Islam. The Sunnis and the Shia. They both say that Yeshua is the Messiah to come. And those are the two witnesses. We'll be right back. Don't miss the next video. Thank you.